Have you realized that the hardest part of your ADHD diagnosis wasn't the diagnosis itself, but what came after? Because suddenly, everything you thought you knew about yourself was up for review. Your habits, your relationships, your reactions, and underneath all of that was this quiet, unsettling question: can I actually trust myself? Because for a lot of us, our late diagnosis doesn't just give us answers. It shows us how we've been second-guessing ourselves all along. Hey, I'm Dr. Regina, Ph.D., and this is Divergent Paths, the podcast where we talk about the things late-diagnosed neurodivergent folks experience, but don't always have the language for. You might know me from my weekly newsletter, Nerd Notes, where I share tips and tricks for working with your brain instead of against it. In this episode, I want to talk about self-trust and what it actually looks like to rebuild it after an ADHD diagnosis. Getting a late ADHD or autism diagnosis brings a disruption to your identity. It can create a lot of clarity, and I've talked a lot about the clarity that came for me with my diagnosis. But it can also create a lot of destabilization where you have a lot of things that you end up questioning. On one hand, it tells you like, oh, here is something that helps me understand so many aspects of my life that I didn't understand before. But at the same time, you start to question, well, what parts of my personality or my achievements or how I've lived my life are actually who I am and not just in response to my late diagnosis. Certain aspects of your life get shaken up. Your understanding of your own behavior, the why and how of what you are doing. Your confidence in your decision-making gets a little shaken. Your sense of reliability, like what you've always sort of known and understood about yourself, gets sort of overturned. You start asking a lot of questions about who you are that you wouldn't have asked before, looking back at your life or even in current situations. Was I wrong about how I interpreted that? Did I overreact? Was I masking so I didn't really understand the circumstances I was in? And how much can I trust my memory and my perceptions of things now with this new information? So one of the big things for me in my late diagnosis and when I started unmasking was to unpack or sort of look back and analyze what were things about my life that were things I really enjoyed and what were things that were in response to my late diagnosis. And I had this realization that so many of my professional accomplishments and things about who I am are because somebody told me I couldn't do it. I've told the story about my PhD. Getting my PhD was in part because my college advisor told me not to get a PhD. And so I, as soon as she said, don't do it, I absolutely was going to do it. But an earlier story along the same lines was my senior year of high school. I wanted to do a solo at our regional competition and to sing a solo at a regional competition. I had never done anything like that before. I had never soloed. I sang in our sort of show choir, but I was not a soloist. I told my teacher that part of the reason why I was doing it was to prove to myself that I wouldn't freeze and that I could do it. And she said, oh, don't worry, you'll probably freeze. That haunted me. It stayed with me, and I didn't freeze, and I didn't end up having problems with my performance. It went really well. I got high marks. I was really pleased with how it went. But there was definitely how dare you tell me that this is something that might happen to me? I'm definitely going to do this in spite of what you've said about me. So where your diagnosis gives you language and concepts to better understand the choices you make, like now I know that solo choice was absolutely my pathological demand avoidance at play. It also means I had to rebuild my relationship with myself to understand like why I was so reactive to these types of situations and what that meant about who I was. So your self-trust gets eroded when you're light diagnosed because you've been masking for years, you've been compensating, you've experienced years of being corrected and told you were doing things wrong or that your perceptions were wrong. You have years of being misunderstood by people who were important to you a lot of the time. And you've internalized messages like you're too sensitive or your lack of focus was because you weren't paying attention or you weren't rigorous enough. The big thing I heard a lot and that a lot of my clients deal with is being told you need to try harder, that it's just a willpower issue when it's not. It's that your brain doesn't work the same way, but we're told it's something you can just strong arm yourself through. What that does, that erosion, means that you start outsourcing your trust. You start looking for those perceptions from other people. So you want to see what their expectations are for your behavior. You want to figure out what the external rules are so you can adhere to them. For a lot of people, you lean into perfectionism. The more perfect you can be about how you present yourself, the better you feel about your performance and your mask, etc. What you don't do is you don't check in with yourself. You don't check in with your somatic experience of the things you go through, how things feel in your body. You check in with how you're being received. So you take that trust and you put it outside yourself. When you're leaning toward perfectionism, it's really easy to, be like, oh, if I just do everything like somebody else tells me to, then I will get a gold star. Your self-doubt didn't come from nowhere. It was built slowly and consistently over time and through that late diagnosis or that late identification of your neurodivergence. When you come to start to understand that you don't trust yourself, your awareness of that becomes really uncomfortable. But that uncomfortable period is absolutely necessary because it is what you need to get into before you can start to trust your own reactions, to trust your perceptions, to trust yourself in the moment. You can ask yourself, questions like, how am I feeling about this? Where is this in my body? Where is this hitching for me and why? And think about if you are cueing that off other people's reactions or if you are coming from an internal space with it. One of the ways to kind of start to work through this is to start allowing yourself to feel your emotions and allow those emotions to inform the decisions you make. Where you can have your emotions be information you use to base your decision on, rather than the drive to make a decision and perhaps impulsively decide something that you might regret later. I recently had a client come in who struggled a lot with anger, with being angry and with feeling her anger. And we worked hard at sort of creating systems for her to learn how to access that anger. And once she did, she realized that it could inform her in conversations she had, especially heated conversations that might have been emotionally charged in a way where when she was masking, she would have shied away from it. But instead, with with being able to feel her anger, she was able to lean into it more. And this client really had a deep sense of satisfaction that came from learning to trust that that emotion was valid. You can't really get to this point of rebuilding without first acknowledging that your doubt is what you've been operating in for a long time. This process of rebuilding self-trust looks a little like it did for my client, where you're learning to understand your emotions and look at your emotions as information that you can help you make decisions. But here are some small things that you can do to build that self-trust. Start with making small agreements with yourself and holding to them. A big one for me was being honest about the kind of music I like and not downplaying my enthusiastic enjoyment of stuff. So that was one small agreement I made with myself. And then following through with it when I was in a conversation, being honest about it. The second I said is like, letting your feelings be informative. They're data. They're not disqualifications. Because we feel our feelings so deeply and so intensely, it's really easy to get caught up in them. So let your feelings be information to help guide your decisions. The power of the pause. Pause before you outsource your reality. Before you start seeking that external validation for something that happened, pause and see if you can find it inside. Think about how you felt about a situation and stick to your feelings versus seeking out validation from multiple sources to tell you what you feel is valid or correct. We want to work toward repair. And you want to work toward repair with yourself just as much as the people in your life. Remember, this is self-trust we're rebuilding. So learning how to trust yourself, you might start saying things like, oh, wow, I really missed that. I didn't see that. And be okay. Like sometimes you miss things instead of shaming yourself about it, because that's part of what builds toward the self-doubt is you shaming yourself about having missed things. And don't make yourself feel bad because there are times when we just don't catch everything. And lastly, stop abandoning yourself in order to maintain the emotional connections you have in your life. You can be kind and self-aligned, right? You can be kind to people and still stay true to yourself. And sometimes saying no is the truest and kindest thing you can do to the people in your life. As I was going through my process of unmasking and getting away from a lot of people-pleasing tendencies I had a fortune cookie story. I got a fortune cookie, and the fortune in the cookie read, telling the truth is an act of love. And that became my mantra for people pleasing. So anytime I start to feel myself slip into that self-abandonment, and where I'm not trusting myself and I'm not trusting myself enough to tell the truth, I remind myself that telling the truth is an act of love. Self-trust doesn't feel like some big showy act. A lot of times it is just truly believing that telling the truth and being your authentic self is an act of love. Self-trust is not having confidence all the time. It's not being certain about everything, and it's not never questioning yourself. It is building that trust that you will handle the outcomes, that you will figure out what is happening in your life, and you won't abandon yourself in the process. You will still doubt yourself sometimes. These are long-standing patterns to break for many of us. You will need support, and sometimes you'll get it wrong. And hopefully you won't spiral the same way you will when you are operating more in masking and in people-pleasing and sort of shame-based approaches. You'll learn to say, I trust myself in ways that I didn't before. And it's okay that I'm still building toward having a deep sense of self-trust. And this, like many things we talk about, is something that takes time. It takes small changes one at a time to get you into feeling that confidence, feeling that belief. It's some small, quiet moments. And once you have those over and over and over again, that sense of self-trust will grow. It makes sense if you're late diagnosed that this is hard because you're unlearning a lot of learned patterns that kept you safe for a really long time. But you can build it. You can rebuild your self-trust. And it's not always about being right. It's about staying on your own side and staying in line with what you want and what your perceptions are. If you're wanting help with rebuilding your self-trust, this is something that I work on with my clients. Right now, I have a package, a deep dive package called the Nerd Out, and I'd love to talk to you about it. So go ahead and book a clarity call. The link is in the show descriptions. And until next time, build that self-trust, one brick at a time.